Welcome to part 3 of the Contracts Manual 2021 update, the basics of contract review from an insurance perspective. We have Nancy Drawin of Vice President of Marsh. She is an attorney and senior consultant in the Contracts Review Division with Marsh. We have James Westbury, who is GMA's Property and Casualty Manager along with an attorney, and we have Matt Artry, who has worked on contracts with Marsh and is currently working with insurance policies within ACCG. So with that said, take it away, Nancy.
Well, hi everyone. Welcome to the last part of our series. I don't have a slide for this, but I feel like it's really important, and that's the first part on number 3, certificates of insurance. You receive them all the time, and there's just a few things that when you do receive them that you really want to keep an eye out for and look at closely. And stop me if you have questions, but I'm going to kind of go through this list. You want to make sure that the certificate has a current date. That's the date that's in the top right corner. Something that's older, things could have changed since that one was issued, so you want a current dated one if it's a new contract, and then you want to make sure you get the renewed one every year when the policy's renewed. In the bottom left of the certificate, you'll see there's the box for certificate holder. You need to double check that and make sure that your city or county is properly named in that box. You want to check for the policy effective dates, which are written in kind of the middle of it. You want to check to make sure that the insurance that is shown on the certificate of insurance matches what the contract says it's the particular person is put to provide you. It's best if you receive that certificate directly from the other party's insurance agent or insurance broker. That way you can feel good that it's not been altered or tampered with, change of dates or things like that. And if at all possible, try to get the copies of those endorsements that we've been talking about the last couple of days. The additional insured endorsement, primary and non-contributory endorsement, waiver of subrogation if you've been able to have that other party waive their subrogation rights against you, and notice of cancellation endorsement. And remember, you can keep asking for a revised and updated certificate until you get the correct one. That's their duty to provide it to you. Keep asking till you get what you need and what's required under the contract. Squeaky wheel will get greased. So thank you. I just wanted to go over that. And if you have any questions, stop me. Otherwise, we'll move on, which is kind of a little bit of a quiz, but not really. I just wanted to throw it out there since we've been talking about it a lot. So who recalls what the benefits of an additional insured, that being an additional insured on the other person's policy? What are those benefits? And why do you want that?
I have no responses, so we're looking for responses, right, Nancy?
I was hoping.
Anybody have a response? Can you restate the question?
I'm asking, what are the benefits of being an additional insured on the other person's policy? Why would you want to ask for that endorsement?
Here's one answer. Here's a couple. You can draw directly from their insurance. You can go directly to the other party's insurance, direct access to the other party's policy. It's all kind of the same.
Spot on. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear. So that's an important takeaway, and I'm glad everybody recalls. So I've got one more question. So why do you want to also be added as primary and non-contributory when you're an additional insured on the other person's policy? What's the benefit in that to you?
Again, looking for responses. Here's one, not required to use GRMA first. Any other responses?
Well, that's actually summed it up. You're going to be, the other's insurance policy is going to pay first, and your own insurance will not have to contribute towards the claim or loss. So well done, everyone. We've been talking about the additional insured endorsements over the last couple of days, and this should be close, one of the few last remaining references to it. But I wanted to make you familiar with the Insurance Services Office's standard endorsements. And I've got the endorsement forms here, up here, the CG 2010, the ongoing operations, and CG 2037 for completed operations. The current versions currently in use are the 0413 and the 1219. This screen does show some slight updates, which I don't think we need to go into in any depth. But the importance is neither one of these versions of either of these two endorsements will include the sole negligence of the additional insured. And I thought you should see the form. That's what you're looking for, or something similar to it. Not every company, insurance company uses the ISO forms, but many do. So let's move on to the second way that you can access the benefits under the other party's insurance requirements, and that is the contractual liability coverage. This is a long slide. In a nutshell, this coverage is where the other party has agreed to indemnify you and hold you harmless for bodily injury and property damage to third parties, the indemnity clause. So this part of the insurance policy will provide coverage or insurance in support of that indemnity clause. There's certain things it will do, certain things it will not do. The highlighted portion is basically the formal language of what I just repeated to you. And that's directly from an ISO policy. ISO stands for Insurance Services Office, and they're kind of the standard group that promulgates insurance policies which are used throughout the industry. So that's your second access to the insurance policy, is the contractual liability coverage, something you want to ask for specifically because it can be excluded out by endorsement from the policy, that tort liability of another assumed. So you do want to be careful and specifically request it. So there's several items that are just flatly not going to be insured under a policy. That's liquidated damages, predetermined amount to be paid by the contracting parties. Breach of contract is not covered. Contractual liability is not the same as breach of contract. If you'll recall, contractual liability has to do with bodily injury and property damage that one party is assumed to pay for on the other's behalf. Willful, wanton misconduct, that's not going to be covered. Warranties and guarantees made between the parties are not covered. So we've talked about all these different parts of the insurance policies, different endorsements that are important for you to ask for, what they may or may not do, and how you will benefit by asking for them, or perhaps saying no to them, such as the waiver of subrogation if your city or county uses the state-funded plans, the pools. So how do you perform a contract review? We're going to kind of go through those steps. Very importantly, you need to know when they need to have the contract back. As I mentioned, I think more than on one occasion, this is something that you should be allowed ample time to review the contract. It's not something that you want to have, 5 minutes because we're getting ready to meet in the conference room to go sign the deal. You need to have time to read it because sometimes you have to go and seek outside information to do a thorough review. So when is it needed by? For those of you that are in the process where you get to submit the contracts for review, give as much time as possible in case it's a prolonged negotiation. And know when it needs to be finalized. Oh, and importantly, that's where my thought was, don't submit it after it's been signed. You've lost your bargaining power at that point, and you may be stuck with some pretty onerous insurance requirements that your insurance program does not satisfy, and you may not even be able to get in the commercial market. So importantly, allow time and do it before you sign. You need to identify who is who. Are you the landlord or the tenant under this particular contract? The supplier, contractor, customer? You want to know whose role is who, because that will help, you know, how the flow of insurance goes, who's being required to carry it. Who is the other party? Are they going to be somebody that where you have the influence and the bargaining power? Or is it somebody that has the bargaining power where you have less influence on the outcome of the negotiations? And of course, what's the relationship between the parties? Is this something that's a one-time contract, or is this where you're going to have a long-term ongoing relationship? It's important to know what the scope of work is. That helps you determine whether the limits make sense or are they outlandish. Some contracts, it's clear, you can find the scope of work. Sometimes you just have to read through a lot of legalese before you figure out what the purpose of the contract is. You may find it that it's attached at the back as an exhibit. You see that a lot with purchasing type contracts, but you want to know what the scope of work is so you can kind of make a ballpark estimation whether these insurance requirements make sense. What's the length of the contract? Is it going to be a 90-day contract? Something quick and done? Never have to get another COI on this again because policy won't renew in that 90 days? Or is this a 10-year contract? And if so, you want to make sure you've got a tickle system in place where you're asking for those certificates of insurance on an annual basis. You want to scan through the entire contract, and this happens more often than I can believe, but somebody will just send portions of the contract, not the whole thing. Now, many contracts are very long, and honestly, I don't need to see the blueprint specs at the end of it. It takes up a lot of memory. But the words, I want to see if there's an insurance clause tucked away somewhere that's maybe outside of the actual paragraph or section of the agreement that says insurance. And I find it a lot. You'll see a little tiny sentence that really does affect, maybe even changes what the full insurance clause says. So you want to see the entire agreement. If you don't have the full agreement, ask for it. When you do receive the agreement, look for terms such as indemnity, limitation of liability in the insurance sections. We prefer to receive our documents in a Word file, and then we'll just, you know, Control F, type in these words or a portion of the words and start searching the document so we can see everywhere that the word insure, INSUR, is mentioned to see if it's, you know, the insurance or somebody insured, and just read through it and see if it's something that we need to put a close eye to or if it's something that's not really a insurance requirement. So please do that. We can explain why you need the full document. When you receive it, again, read through those important clauses that we've talked about over the last couple of days, the indemnification, limitation of liability, and obviously the insurance section. What's the point of my being here otherwise? Search for these common words, as we just talked about. Just do a Control F and search the document. You can do that in a PDF document, but we like to do red lines into our reviews so you can see who made the changes, what those changes are. And PDF does not do it as well, even with the fancy Adobe. Word does it very well. If you have anything that you have questions about, that you kind of have a little head scratcher over, highlight it and come back to it. I do that regularly. I'll see a portion of an insurance requirement that I'm thinking, I don't like this, but it may be corrected later, or I would add something here, but let me read the whole thing before I go in and type it. And so I'll just highlight the area, put a comment to the side with a note to myself in case I'm interrupted as to why I have highlighted the area, and then read through the whole insurance clause and go back and address what things I had questions with. Actually, a very handy research is plain old Google and Black's Law Dictionary online. There's other insurance type of research materials that are paid for, but these are free. And actually doing a Google search will often turn up an Army article, which is an insurance related company that produces a lot of materials on insurance. I don't recall what they stand for, but anyways, you will find a lot of information on both. Search through it, and you know it's Google, so you have to be careful as to the reliability of the source. But I found both to be very helpful. As I said, Google will also point you to some important resources from our insurance services offices and other insurance credentialing and qualified groups that speak on that. If you have questions, reach out to somebody and ask them. On this panel today, you have a lot of people with support and knowledge. They are there. I'm sure that they would be happy to assist you. Try to find an answer yourself, but that doesn't mean you can always find the answer. As I mentioned, and I would recommend this in your own reviews, to use Word and use the red line feature or the red line track changes feature, so you can kind of see what the changes have been made. I think it's a appropriate way to handle contracts in negotiation. If you received it in a PDF, try to convert it. Not everything will convert, but if it does, again, makes it a lot easier so you can see what changes have been made along the way during the negotiation. Anybody have any questions about that?
I see no questions, Nancy.
If you need these additional items when you're doing the review, ask for them in copies of endorsements. Maybe you need to receive a quote for a new policy or new type of coverage, certificates of insurance, which we've just spoken about, performance bonds or surety bonds. Speak up, ask, get, and you shall receive, as long as you keep asking, I guess. And then once this is all completed, the review's done, file all your correspondence together so you have a file you can go back to later. I work on some contracts, honestly, that the negotiations started in 2017, and they're still not finalized. So when you have protracted long negotiations, you want to have a place where you can go back to it and see what's been changed. So you're not revisiting and trying to make the same changes and force some change that's never going to happen at 4 years down into the contract negotiations. So we have some best practices, strategies, tips, and tricks to leave with you as well. Want to initiate a coordinated contract review process. Work as a team. You need whoever's out there, I guess your procurement people, to understand and be involved in the process. They'll get it to you. Make sure they can get it to you timely so you can do a thorough review. Get it reviewed before it's signed. If you need to consult an attorney or somebody in risk management to make sure that that everything's as it should be, allow time for that. But the more people that are consulted in the process, if you're unable to do it yourself, then the better off you will be, because you will have everything into the document at one time. Establish the contract review criteria. You want to know when to go to your legal department and when you should take it to a risk manager. I assume that that's something that y'all have in place. Not sure. The third bullet's the same as we've already discussed. You want to know who's going to be the responsible person to sign off on it. If you are unable to negotiate the insurance to the terms that you want, 100%, which is usually the case, who's the party that's going to sign off on that and say, okay, we've done our best, this is acceptable, we've made an exception, here's the exception. You just need to know who to do that and how that process is documented. I'm in the process of helping a new client that's a new company help establish those types of procedures in place and how to document that. And it's important because the problem on the contract isn't likely to arise in the next 3 days. It's going to arise years later. And you want to know whether that contract had been looked at thoroughly, had received its proper approvals, anything where it's an exception to your norm. You want to make sure that's documented so you fully understand it. how are y'all broken up? Is there a risk management department or a single person or multiple people that are involved in the contract reviews? How does it work at the various levels in the cities and counties in Georgia?
Does anybody want to volunteer? Anybody want to raise their hand? Maybe James, you can kind of, anything you want to give an example of?
It is all over the board. We have 159 counties and 537 municipalities. Some cities are so small that they have no employees. They'll have a few, constitutional officers, like a city clerk who's not really an employee, or you go up as large as the city of Atlanta, which is just enormous. And, we deal with a lot of different structures. A lot of times when you don't have a city that's large enough to have a full-time risk manager, you'll have the HR director that wears both hats. Then when you get into the larger cities, you'll see an HR director and a risk manager. Counties tend to be larger than cities, so a lot of times there's more sophistication and more resources, although this is not always true out in the rural areas simply from a lack of resources and size, but it really covers the whole waterfront. So you see all of that in Georgia. I'd say like in the metro Atlanta area, you probably, the counties are pretty large and have pretty sophisticated structures, as do the larger cities. And around the metropolitan areas, the counties are going to have more of a structure. In the cities, it just depends on the size. You'll have a metropolitan area like Macon that has Macon and Bibb County as a large consolidated government, but then you have tiny rural areas within 20 miles of Macon. So it just depends. You have a lot of variation within the state.
Well, I can see where that then poses a challenge in doing this, the insurance requirements and reviewing contracts altogether, that it's such a wide variety. For those of you that are kind of on your own because you're in a smaller location, and you do have resources, and honestly, some of the resources that we've discussed just a little while ago can help you figure out what's going on, what they're asking for as far as the insurance. I mean, if you see a type of insurance that maybe isn't something you're familiar with, we talked about employment practices liability policies yesterday, and if you're not very familiar with it, you can do a quick search and then have an understanding for why that insurance is in place and what it's supposed to cover. So there are some immediate resources. Fortunately, thanks to now that we don't have to go down to the library and pull out the books from the shelf, though I do miss that, we can do that from our desk. So, use those resources, reach out to people. I don't know if you have legal representation in all the cities and counties, but, when you have that available, that's helpful to coordinate because the indemnification is not insurance. So when we're doing our contract review, we will, like I had mentioned, we will look at it to make sure that it aligns with the insurance coverages and the additional insured that's being offered. But we don't go in there and make any changes or red lines. We leave that to the lawyers and let them do that. They'll have a bigger picture generally about what the contract's about. We kind of go in there with the who, what, where, when, and how, and try to take that piece of information and make sure that the insurance that is being required, our client can meet those requirements with their insurance program. And if not, make the adjustments and have to explain that this is what their coverage has. Can't do this because it just isn't part of the insurance program. And remember that if it's not part of your insurance program, it's very appropriate in your negotiation to say, we can't do that. Our insurance does not cover that. I'm thinking of, off the top of my head, a lot of times you'll see medical expense coverage required under commercial general liability. And that's just kind of usually a small dollar amount, and it will just pay medical expenses without going through the whole claims process. Well, a lot of companies don't buy it. It's an optional coverage. So it would make no sense to sign an agreement that says you're going to provide medical expense coverage under your commercial liability if you don't have it. So we strike that regularly, and people are always like, well, why not? It's because we don't have it. It's not available. We can't give that to you. Some of the larger clients I work with, they just kind of self-insure that. They pay it out of their own pocket. Let's see. I got off on a tangent there. So more of our tips and strategies. We've talked about that before. Get the contract to whomever's doing the review as quickly as possible. That's incredibly important. I guess I can't reiterate that enough. When there's onerous insurance requirements, push back. Often you feel like that because it's written on the page, there's not a lot of room for negotiation, or maybe because it seems like a really tough technical or legal thing that it cannot be negotiated. I've seen some very large companies negotiate and give things away that they would prefer not to, but when push comes to shove, they want that contract signed. It's generally in both parties' best interest to reach a mutual agreement so that there is a contract in place and the work can go forward. You always want to be careful of who was the drafter of the contract, because whoever drafted the contract is likely going to have it written in their favor. So if you use the contract manual and some of the templates that we have in there, it's definitely drafted in your favor. And if somebody comes to you with their own paper, as we would call it, and it's going to be more biased towards them and more beneficial to them. So, know that, use that in your negotiation. Never be afraid to push back. Just circling back to certificates of insurance and the importance of receiving them. While the certificate itself is not anything but just evidence on a particular day that this insurance was in place, if you have copies of those endorsements attached to it, then you do have basically pieces of the insurance policy. And they're the pieces of the insurance policy that will mean the most to you when you're an additional insured, getting primary and non-contributory coverage. Maybe if they've waived their right of subrogation against you, meaning they can't come and collect against you for any claim paid on your behalf, and that notice of cancellation, the first three are more important. You have pieces of the policy, and those pieces are the ones that are going to be very important if a claim is paid. How you can go forward and say, I'm an additional insured, here's my endorsement, I'm on this policy, here's a copy of the contract, okay, insurance company, here's our claim, and get it paid. That doesn't work for the additional insured channels. You have the alternative channel of using the contractual liability coverage. That generally does require litigating or moving into that type of arena to receive the benefits. But if that other party has indemnified you for bodily injury or property damage to third parties, then you have rights under their insurance policy as an additional insured, and also under the contractual liability coverage to get to their policy and have that claim paid on your behalf, or have you reimbursed for a payment that you may have made, which is often how the indemnity works. When you're reviewing those certificate of insurance and the request for one, I often see, and I actually see it more from counties and governments, where they want to put specific quotes that they have say this must be on the certificate of insurance. I usually will strike out the quotation marks, because the form itself is governed by the insurance department. This is what they've blessed the form, and that's the one that's in use. There's a few places where there's a little bit of leeway to write, but most of what you find in a quoted mark is going to go beyond what maybe the endorsement for additional insured says, or something like that. So if you could avoid agreeing to quoted wording on a certificate of insurance, that's in your best interest, keeps you from being in breach of contract, or a technical breach, as I would consider it, for not submitting something that's compliant to the terms of the agreement. James, do you have anything to add?
I agree with everything you've said. You start the contract review process early, involve a lot of places aren't going to have an attorney that's going to be an insurance or a construction expert. You need to use the insurance broker or agent as your first line of defense, you know, in connection with your attorney in that context. And, you know, make sure that you address these things early. If you want the other party to add you as an additional insured, carry you primary non-contributory, you want to make sure that you've got the certificate and the endorsement, or if not the endorsement, look at the policy and see if it's got the blanket language in it to make sure that you actually have a contractual requirement that backs up what you think you have on the certificate. And push back if you know, because a lot of times with cities and counties, the other party is wanting to do business with you. And, you know, in a lot of these transactions, it's kind of like when you're dealing with a salesman. You know, the salesman always wants to get the deal done and doesn't really care that much about, you know, what happens after the deal is closed. A lot of times it's that way with the people putting the deal together. The insurance, you know, and legal requirements, indemnification, those are really important to people like Nancy and Matt and me, because we live in that world. But people who are concerned about putting a deal together, they're more concerned about whatever it is they're trying to do. They're trying to build a building or a bridge, or, you know, engage some kind of service. So a lot of times you can push back and get what you want, but you got to know to ask. And the key thing is to make sure that you get people involved who, you know, have resources and have depth in areas of knowledge you don't have, so that you can make sure that you cover your bases. I think it's a great thing that so many people are participating in this 3-day webinar, because they're gaining knowledge to be more effective at what they're doing to make sure they do this right. And I've been impressed by I've gotten questions outside the context of the webinar, after the webinar, from people asking about, you know, additional insured status and certificates of coverage. And that tells me people are paying attention and they're concerned about these topics, which is good, because a lot of times these are the things that the risk managers and the you know, the insurance people care about, but it's not necessarily you know, the first priority of the people putting the deal together. But I think this is great.
Nancy.
Yes.
Nancy, I would like to say one of the easiest things to notice in a contract are the limits of insurance requested, and that's very often contracts that get signed, and then it's noticed later that the limit of insurance in the contract is requiring 2 or 3 or 4 million. The city or county has 1 million. Usually the cities and counties have a lower limit because of immunities, especially on auto, but often are still signing those contracts. And in some cases, sign contracts that are requiring coverage that they don't even have, let alone the proper limit for. Could be they sign for pollution liability, or maybe even cyber liability if they have lower limits. But those are a whole lot easier items to find than some of the wording we've been talking about with additional insured and all that you have to kind of really know it. But it's pretty easy to see a 3 million and know you have a 1 million. So maybe even start there before you even get into the wording.
I think you bring in a very important point, Matt. That is a low-hanging fruit way to take care of your county's budget, is to make sure you are aware of the insurance limits that you currently have and never agree to go over, and what's in your program. If you don't have cyber, please don't agree to provide cyber. And I'll tell you right now, cyber, that market's hard. It's very hard for businesses to get. If they don't have an existing cyber policy in place, they're having a very hard time obtaining it or increasing limits. So that you wouldn't want to agree to something that you may not even be commercially feasible at this time or within your budget. So you would be you want to know, you're going to, most programs, there's a commercial general liability, an auto, workers' comp, and maybe an umbrella access. I don't know how your pools work exactly, but I'm assuming at least those coverages are in place. Y'all are in a unique position. You have immunity, and sovereign immunity, which is most commercial businesses for which I usually provide this service don't have that. Having negotiated with government all over the country, I know about it and familiar with it, but it's not something that my clients generally have in their favor. So you certainly don't want to run the risk of offering something, I don't know, that could perhaps interfere with your ability to claim sovereign immunity. That's an incredibly good point, Matt. I was going to, just after I asked James, I was going to ask you, because I know during the course of putting this program together and updating the manual, I worked closely with Matt and Ashley and James as well. And we've just had a lot of conversations over things that are trying to highlight and make sure that we brought them to your attention during the course of these last 3 days. Matt, was there something else? I know you have had a couple items on your hit list before.
Yeah, number one is obviously the more lead time you have, like we mentioned, to review it before signature. That's number one. Number two, the more you can require things up front in bid specs or just part of your standard procurement, the better results you're going to have. If you award contracts and then try to add insurance requirements on it after the contract is signed or after you've awarded the contract, it's a lot harder to get things done. But if you're very clear up front what your requirements are, that any bidder is going to be required to follow those requirements, you're going to have a lot better results. The entities that do a great job getting what they want, it's because they communicate what their requirements are ahead of time. You know, in some cases that may scare someone off from doing business with your entity, but in most cases, the requirements are pretty standardly available insurance in the marketplace. So probably nothing that Nancy talked about or that's going to be in the manual is not attainable if you're a reputable business. So it's a lot easier than probably it sounds. And the only other thing I'll say, the revised manual that's coming out, we tried to consolidate in a couple places, make it a little easier to follow, specifically related to the insurance part. And we've added a couple newer items, specifically related to the cyber or the technology operations. There's going to be checklists in the back and a few other additions that hopefully make it easier to follow and implement your program.
So can I open this up to questions amongst everybody that's attending?
Yes, please do. Anybody have any questions? Anything anyone would like to ask before we end this webinar? How do we get a copy of the manual you mentioned? So again, it'll be completed. It's in the process of being reviewed. It's almost being completed. When I send out the links and a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, I'll also send an electronic version of that particular manual. So that will be coming out to all those that have registered. And as soon as it's completed, it will be distributed to all those that are registered. Who else has a question? Good question. Anyone else? Questions or comments? If you want to ask a question, you can click on the red box with the white arrow. Within that, there'll be a question box. Just submit your question type that in and you should be good to go.
Well, we're hopefully receiving a question or two, because I thought yesterday's interaction and engagement was very helpful and informative. I'm telling you, I'm taking something away from this because I've learned a lot about Georgia law in the last couple of days, and I assist with a lot of companies that negotiate in Georgia and with your counties and governments. So I'll be better informed in the future and understand things better. But I do want to say that working on the manual and working with the team here has been a really interesting and fun project that we've enjoyed being a part of here at Marsh. We look forward to future opportunities to work with anybody that's involved on the call. We found it just a good process to put together something that was a complete and pretty comprehensive manual for your use. It was impressive, and the original document was very impressive. We just assisted with the insurance sections and tried to bring those up to current and what's in today's world where the risks may be, to make sure that y'all are more protected. But it was just a wonderful project and very engaging. A lot of dialogue with everybody that participated with it. And again, I take away a lot of information from these last couple of days, as well as working on the project.
I have a question. Can you explain quickly when it is important to ask to be added as an additional insured on a vendor's policy? Is this a reasonable request?
In today's world, it is a reasonable request. Pretty much you can ask on every contract. If they tell you no because you asked, then follow that up with why. But if the vendor's doing the work and there's any risk that you may be involved in some sort of future litigation down the road because of their work, bodily injury or property damage, you definitely want to ask to be included as additional insured on their policy. Again, it gives you direct access to their insurance policy for payment of claims and defense. It'll also be, if you get primary and non-contributory, it will pay first, and your pool or your insurance program will not have to pay and contribute. So basically, it's a risk transfer device. If the risk is on the vendor's work, then the vendor should be covering you as well as additional insured.
I have another.
If you don't do that, your carrier is going to end up having to deal with the claim, and then you're going to have the city or the county plus the vendor in litigation. You're going to have two pocketbooks it's going to come out of. They're paying two sets of lawyers. So the claim is going to be more valuable to the plaintiff, and it's going to be more expensive to defend. So it's much easier. There's no reason not to ask for additional insured status on any vendor you're dealing with. And if they want the business, they're not going to balk at it. It's not going to cost them any more to put your city or county on there. So it's always a good idea to ask for it.
Yeah, and it's not available on all types of insurance, but the primary policies that you want to see it is your commercial general liability, the auto policy of another, and their umbrella excess.
Here's a follow-up question. What is a reason for a vendor to refuse this? So it relates to the previous question.
I really can't, there's not a commercially insurance perspective reason for a vendor to refuse. Now, if they should not agree to include you as additional insured and cover your sole negligence, that's not reasonable. But the standard additional insured endorsements that we just looked at a little while ago from ISO, those do not include coverage for your sole negligence, and there should be no reason not to say, yes, we'll add you as additional insured. And the reason why most people are included under a blanket endorsement is because the insurance company now doesn't have to, and they used to charge for this, issue a new endorsement for each new additional insured. So it's become a streamlined and economical process for people to do business and appropriately place the risk on the person doing the work. So if a vendor tells you no, I would ask why, but I would probably start tiptoeing away from that vendor and look for alternatives.
What is the language again as it relates to that? Where is this language again? Where is this language?
in your manual, you will see that there is going to be requirements for the vendors, consultants. Oh my, I think there's about 6 or 7 different templates that were created where they are to include you as additional insured on a primary and non-contributory basis, and depending on what kind of work it is, for ongoing and completed operations. And then it will state that completed operations coverage needs to be for X amount of time. If it's something construction related, it will be you should ask for it for a longer period of time for the statute of limitation or statute of repose. If it's something that's, a smaller transaction and maybe service related, if it's products, that gets a little bit different. But we've included that type of wording in those templates that are included in the manual.
It's a tremendous resource, that manual. It's really detailed. It's a lengthy document. It's got Georgia law, but it's got a lot of good contract language in there. Something people need to be, cities and counties need to be really mindful of on public contracts. Some of these things you have to put in the contract for your vendors. For example, you've got to have a payment bond requirement. If you don't have a payment bond requirement for a general contractor, if you pay them and they don't pay the subcontractor, there's a statute that allows the subcontractor to sue the city or county directly. That's a waiver by statute of sovereign immunity. And those claims are not covered because they arise out of a breach of contract. We've got a case where a member of our pool ended up in that situation, and we had a coverage dispute, and we went to the Court of Appeals, and they said, no, that falls within your breach of contract language in your coverage agreement. So the city ended up having to pay twice for that work. They paid the contractor who went out of business, and then they ended up having to pay the sub again. So you need to be and that yet another reason to, pull in your insurance people and your city or county attorney and, use those resources that you have available to you. At each of the pools, I know there are people that'll help you work through these issues. It's not going to cost you extra money, and they have insurance expertise, and they want to make sure that things are structured properly to protect our members.
Yes, I want to say on that, the top thing you can do is have a standard contract template from your entity, but that's not always possible. So there will probably be some situations where you're looking at signing a contract that's on the vendor or contractor's template. The problem with that is obviously that's going to be in their favor in regards to the insurance section. The tip there would be it is a lot better to try to get an insurance addendum added to the end of those rather than trying to strike through and rewrite the actual insurance sections of those. You're going to leave something out. You probably frustrate people. You may even be embarrassed that you're redlining so much, but it's probably a lot easier to get it approved if you just have your standard addendum and say this is the city or county standard, we require this, and let them start revising that and then throw theirs out completely. So that would be the biggest tip there to get what you want.
It's a good tip.
And that would have the additional insured language and so forth on that.
So I got a comment here. Very informative across the board. Thanks to the team. Thank you, guys. Anybody else have any comments or questions? Thank everyone for all your work in putting these webinars together. They were very informative. Greetings and thanks from Donaldsonville. Looking forward to the manual. Thanks to all. Well, it sounds like we've kind of wrapped things up. Nancy, James, and Matt, really want to thank you for all your efforts and the words of wisdom you provided to the members. It sounds like it's very much appreciated. As I said previously, I will be at the conclusion of this. We'll be waiting for the contracts manual to be finished. Hopefully that will be done quickly. Once that is done, I will be sending a copy of the presentation along with links to the recording of each of these particular webinars and an electronic version of the contracts manual. To all those that registered, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to send those my way. I'll forward you to your prospective person that you'd like to have answer. With that said, we will say goodbye to everyone. Thank you again, Nancy. Thank you, James. Thank you, Matt. And we will talk later.
Thank you, everyone. I've enjoyed it.